So, as I was saying, the program itself is the back door. You don't have to hunt around for the back door or figure out a special passcode. The program is pure energy, and it responds to resonant frequencies, just like a crystal glass humming along with a particular sound. "All right, Thomas," says Naya, "but tell me, how do you get the program to hum along with you?" "Well, it's something you always tell me between lifetimes," says Thomas, grinning. Naya smiles. "If you would only love more, all limitations in your life would vanish," says Thomas, finishing the statement. "And how will that help you when you can't remember it?" says Naya thoughtfully. "Well, like I said, the program itself is the back door, so you don't have to know anything about it. Every player has access to it at all times. But of course, we forget everything. So I just have to have a compelling reason to love, and then I could work around my lack of empathy problem." "All right, I'm listening. What's your plan?" says Naya supportively. "In my research, I've discovered a game where I can be a high priest who learns how to perfectly navigate the program, to the point that I could even manipulate it, with love, of course." Thomas adds quickly, "Did you research all of the variables as well?" says Naya. "Yes, and you're right, the failure rate, at least in regard to my plan, is about 99.999%, he says, rolling his eyes in acknowledgement of Naya's warnings. "But here's my idea. I will have a daughter that I dearly love, and to be sure of that, I have picked someone who I have loved in every game we've ever played, no matter what parts we've played. And she has always loved me as well. Of course, other things have gone wrong," Thomas admits, knowing it is a complete understatement. "But I really believe this will work. Even though I won't feel empathy, I will consistently and powerfully be feeling love. I can't help but love her more and more as she grows up. And when a player loves like that, the resonant frequency in the avatar body will oscillate with the program, automatically overriding all limitations," says Thomas, so proud of himself he's practically glowing. "Thomas, you seem to be forgetting all the things that can go wrong. You're planning to play a game as a wealthy, powerful man in ancient Egypt. You've never lived in that time period. You can't possibly know how you will react. On top of that, you were talking about loving a child. Yes, that kind of love can last a lifetime, but human emotions can change. Children change. They grow up. They move away. They can disappoint you, and you don't know how you will feel when that happens." I know, but that's not going to happen. I've already taken everything into account. I have contracts with everyone I'll be playing with as well. So there are certain things I know will happen," says Thomas with the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning. Patiently, Naya says, "Every time you've played as a man, you have plans to enlighten all of humanity, and then your ego kicks in. Someone does something you don't like, or something happens that you can't control, and you suddenly feel separate and disconnected. And you feel this so powerfully, your experiences go from bad to worse, as the program quickly and powerfully outpictures the intensity of what you feel." "I know I've made mistakes in the past, but I've learned from them," says Thomas earnestly. I've calculated the perfect time to go back and to make changes. My idea will change everything. I even have more than one alternate ending. And yes, there's a chance it won't work. But what if it does work? The alterations to the program would stop human suffering. I could make the game fun again, says Thomas, smiling hopefully. Naya, think about the real purpose of the game. It is designed to make us forget who we are. How much adventure could you have? How courageous would you be if you knew there was nothing to fear? People who want to play it safe stay here in the spirit world. They go to concerts and paint and write poetry. They never have to worry about ending up in the dark realms because they never go anywhere or do anything challenging. Game players are the cosmic badass renegades of the entire universe, says Thomas, laughing. We don't go to Earth to play it safe. We don't go there afraid of screwing things up. All right, Thomas. Imagine you have manipulated the program and created this perfect world you're aiming for. People love each other. They play with other like-minded players. Everyone shares the bounty of Earth equally and fairly. There is no lack and you have no limitations. Everything and everyone is in perfect balance. Love prevails. Now, given eternity, how long would it take for you to get bored? How long would it take before you wanted a challenge? Not long, given eternity, says Thomas thoughtfully. That's why I'm telling you, again, you don't need to fix the game. The program isn't broken. It works exactly as it was intended to work. Smiling warmly, Thomas says, I do thank you for your advice, Naya. Your words of wisdom are always something I take to heart, he adds, putting his hand to the middle of his chest. But I'm sure you know I've already made up my mind. Yes, of course, Thomas, says Naya, smiling affectionately. You are indeed a cosmic renegade, and you have a beautiful, kind, and strong heart. As you can see, she admits graciously, I am one to stay securely in the spirit world and give advice. I'm happy to leave all of the audacious experience to badass adventurers like yourself. Instantly the scene disappears. Thomas is back in his chair contemplating what he had just seen. Then a holographic image appears as if responding to his thoughts and shows Thomas playing out the lifetime he has been so eagerly anticipating. Everything goes as planned. As predicted, his ability to feel empathy is no match compared to his desire for power, but that is not unusual for an imposing high-born man in ancient Egypt, and clearly it doesn't slow down his progress. He is rich, brilliant, charismatic, and very well connected. After his marriage, and with their combined fortunes, Thomas becomes one of the wealthiest, most influential men in Egypt. When his young wife dies in childbirth, just 9 months after their wedding, she leaves him with a healthy, beautiful baby girl, and that is all he really wanted. He doesn't remember why he wanted a daughter so badly, nor does he question his utter devotion to her. Standing quietly next to Thomas, you watch as the years pass quickly, and though you don't focus upon any specific point in time, you can see the energy exchange between Thomas and his daughter, and it is just as loving and pure as he had predicted. His life is going better than he could possibly have planned, and you wonder if maybe he's right. Maybe there's something his daughter can teach him about loving and caring for others. Then the images slow down, and you see Thomas's teenage daughter, Juliana, standing on a balcony looking out over the ocean. She is a tall, stunningly beautiful and graceful young woman with vivid green eyes and long wavy auburn hair. And then a sudden, shocking recognition sweeps over you as you realize you yourself had played the part of Juliana in that lifetime. You adore Thomas, and he couldn't love you more. He continually gives you anything and everything you want. So when you fell in love with your father's champion chariot driver, you weren't the least bit concerned, because even though the object of your desire is low-born, he has brought the attention of Egypt's most elite families to Thomas's door, and consequently more money, power, and prestige has come to your own family. So Thomas loves this handsome chariot driver like a son, and has promised to help him rise up through the ranks to the highest position possible given his birth. In the meantime, there have been offers for your hand in marriage, but Thomas is in no rush to lose his beloved and only child. You take advantage of this by convincing your father to let you choose the perfect man, who will not only make you happy, but also add to the status of your family. That left Thomas more than content to build a palatial home next door for you and your future husband. Though you know your father is, at least on the surface, looking for acceptable suitors, you also know that sometimes parents would surprise their offspring with the happy or not so happy news that an engagement has been arranged. You think arranged marriages are barbaric and much closer to your father's breeding program for his racehorses than the way a young woman should be expected to enter into marriage. Besides, you are already madly in love, so you decide to take matters into your own hands. Early one evening, after the horses have been fed, and while no one is paying any attention, you sneak out of the house and wander through the barn until strong arms surround you and pull you into an empty stall. You throw your arms around a devastatingly handsome young man in his 20s, with dark eyes and hair, angular features, curly black hair, and a muscular tanned body. Though Juliana has no idea she's playing a game, you instantly recognize that Matthew is the soul inhabiting the avatar. As Juliana, you know that if you tell your father you want to marry Matthew, your father would say no, and there's a good chance that you would never see Matthew again. But if you tell your father how much you love Matthew, and that you are already pregnant with his child, your father could hardly say no. He had never said no to you, ever. Besides, your father is in a position to elevate Matthew's standing in society and could easily allow you to marry. And then, of course, you would simply move into the house next door. Your father would happily spoil his grandchildren, and you would have the best of both worlds. Your father's love and the love of the man you desire more than anything in the world. So you and Matthew became secret lovers, regularly meeting in deserted places or swimming naked in the ocean whenever you can sneak out in the middle of the night. You are so in love with Matthew, the time between your clandestine meetings seems to drag on forever, and you can hardly wait until you're married and can sleep together each night and wake every morning in each other's arms. So you are completely thrilled when you discover you are pregnant. But this is the moment when Naya's predictions begin to play out. When you reveal your pregnancy and plans for marriage, you expected that your father might be a bit surprised, maybe even temporarily upset. But never in your life would you have considered the possibility that your own father, your hero, and the person who had loved you unconditionally from the day you were born, would treat you in the most horrendous way. Thomas is in such a rage and so humiliated, he has you locked in your bedroom. But from your current perspective, you can see that he has done this because of his pride and lack of empathy, and that he will never see or speak to you again for the rest of your life. You are also able to see everything that happens to Matthew. Matthew is hauled into the streets and publicly beaten to death. But rather than going to the spirit world when his soul essence left his avatar body, Matthew returned to find you. He quickly discovers it's impossible to communicate with you, because even though he can see himself and hear his own voice, he may as well have been in a different world. Gradually, he realizes he's living in some kind of strange parallel existence. He is as close to you as his own breath, but he can't make his presence known to you. He can see the future, but nothing good is coming, and he is powerless to change any of it. Then one night, as he is sitting watching you sleep, you pop out of your body, and for the first time you are actually able to see him. Bursting into tears, you throw your arms around his neck, and to Matthew's complete and total astonishment, you can physically feel each other. That night, you make love all night long, but in the morning, when you awaken, you burst into tears when you realize it was only a dream. Your heart is breaking all over again. From your current perspective, you can see that though Matthew is invisibly present with you all day long, he decides it is best to leave your room after you fall asleep. And despite the fact that he wants nothing more than to be your lover again, he doesn't want to upset you, knowing that you would wake up in more pain than ever, thinking it was all a dream. So on this particular night, he drifts down to the local tavern, where inside it is business as usual. Prostitutes clinging to men who have the means to pay for their services. Some patrons are gambling, while others begin raising their voices as they become progressively more inebriated. However, being out of body, Matthew sees everything from an entirely new and strange perspective. Hovering around the men in the tavern are dark entities, those who had once inhabited human avatars, but who now are more shadow-like versions of who they had been prior to their deaths. As Matthew takes in this scene, it appears they are waiting for something to happen, as if they are dark moths who have been drawn to a flickering flame inside a lantern. In spite of their relentless efforts, they aren't able to get close due to an ethereal egg-shaped energy field surrounding each person. This energy isn't multicolored light that Matthew is now used to seeing emanating from avatar bodies. It is more like a barely visible protective shell. However, many of the shells surrounding the avatars in this place had become dull and somewhat opaque, with dark holes or tears on their surface. Matthew observes one man in particular who is becoming progressively more inebriated by the minute, as dark entities gather around him with great anticipation. The moment the man passes out, the most powerful entity among the group forces its way into his body through one of the tears in his protective shell. It is at that very moment that Matthew clearly understands the attraction. This menacing being was savoring the feeling of inebriation, and even more than that, it is able to take control of the man's body as well. When the man eventually regains consciousness, he becomes angry and mean. But what he doesn't know is that he is literally not himself. The entity is controlling all of his words and actions. By the morning, the man will remember nothing other than a pounding headache and a hangover to prove he had far too much to drink the night before. From his current non-physical perspective, Matthew has already seen what is coming for you as Juliana. He knows your baby daughter will be taken from you and given to a trusted older shepherd who will then leave the helpless newborn on a remote hillside to die. Matthew also knows there is nothing he can do without an avatar body. But that night in the tavern, he'd suddenly had an idea. And the next day, Matthew begins following the shepherd, who always has a flask of wine at his side. Every time the man gets drunk, Matthew attempts passing through a hole in his protective shield so that he can practice controlling the man's words and actions. To his surprise, passing through the shield and getting control isn't all that difficult under the right circumstances. But getting the man's body to do what Matthew wants it to is like getting on a horse and trying to ride with no experience or training. Day after day, Matthew continues practicing until he's completely able to control the man whenever necessary. But in order for his idea to work, his timing has to be perfect. The man has to be drunk enough for Matthew to project himself through the shield, but not too drunk for his avatar to function properly. And there is a limited amount of time Matthew can stay inside the man's avatar before he is automatically ejected by the program. When you give birth to your daughter, just as Matthew had seen, the little girl is torn from your desperate arms and given to the shepherd with instructions to let the child die on a hilltop far away. The man always did as he was told, but he had never been asked to do something this barbaric. Therefore he began to drink in earnest as he carried the baby along a familiar winding pathway next to a river and then climbed to the top of a distant hill. This was far enough away from human ears that no one would ever hear the baby's cries. And though he knows she is going to die no matter what he does, he gently lays the sleeping newborn on the ground as the full moon begins to rise. It is a deep, blood-red moon, and he would have walked quickly away, but he'd had too much to drink. So he sits down heavily on the ground next to the child, and in a few moments he is sound asleep. Matthew instantly shoots into the man's body, but the shepherd is so drunk he can do little more than wait for the man's head to clear. Finally, he manages to open the man's eyes, and then Matthew notices coffee plants growing nearby. So he stands up carefully, and after a few unsteady paces, he gathers some beans and returns to his sleeping baby. There's little he can do in his current condition, so he sits in the moonlight, chewing on the beans one at a time, until his mind finally begins to clear. The moon lights up the landscape with a pinkish glow as Matthew gently gathers his sleeping daughter into his arms and carries her carefully down the hillside. He knows exactly where to go as he follows a path along the creek and on into a dense forest. Though he has drifted along this path many times out of body, it is far more difficult being inside the body of a fairly drunk shepherd with poor eyesight and moonlight that is barely able to penetrate the treetops. So he is grateful he had the foresight to spend plenty of time memorizing the path. The trail winds its way into a clearing of ancient, slender gray stones, towering 10 to 12 feet tall. They appear to be strategically placed into a large, perfect circle and stand looming like immense, silent guardians. In the center of this circle is a gnarled old tree adorned with all kinds of offerings, everything from flowers to food to crystals, all laid carefully at its base or in the hollows and crevices of its trunk. Matthew had been visiting here, out of body, for months on the evening of each full moon. He knew this was a sacred place, and that a small group of forest women would soon be gathering together to dance naked in the moonlight. For months, he had whispered into the mind of the most sensitive woman in the group that a baby was coming soon and would be left in their care at the next blood moon. And so when he placed his precious daughter in the center of the circle, he knew he was fulfilling the prophecy he had created. And he had already seen that his daughter would be raised with love and care in this hidden woodland world, and that she would ultimately possess a great deal of carefully concealed magic. Matthew stayed in the shepherd's body long enough to observe the women as they discovered his daughter sleeping under the sacred tree, bathed in moonlight, and then he moved as quickly as possible until he reached the stables at Thomas's estate in the dead of night. Moonlight, streaming through cracks in the walls, provides just enough light for Matthew to climb up a ladder into the hayloft. He sits down with his back against the wall and then exits the shepherd's body. Matthew knows that even if the man happens to recall some strange memories from the morning, or wonder how he came to be in the barn, he certainly wouldn't hike back to see what had become of the baby. Leaving the shepherd's body sleeping comfortably, Matthew is able to fly quickly back to you, just as you are secretly being taken out of your home in the dead of night. The next day your clothing, possessions, and portraits are all burned. Matthew stays with you night and day as the small caravan journeys south along the Nile. Though you are young, your body is weak, and you've never had time to recover. But what is even worse is all of the pain you carry inside. The loss of Matthew has been unbearable on its own, but losing your child and knowing your daughter is surely dead is more painful than you can bear. By the time the caravan reaches the temple of Hathor, you are more dead than alive. Your body is unceremoniously dumped in the dirt in front of the main steps leading inside. Several priestesses come to your rescue, and though you recover to some degree over time, you never regain your strength, nor do you leave the temple until several years later on a beautiful autumn day. The merest breath of wind blows puffy white clouds gently across an indigo sky as your body is ceremoniously curled into the fetal position and buried deep in the sand. As your soul lifts from your lifeless body, you see Matthew and realize he has been with you all along. Intense love intermingles with guilt and shame as you feel a deep and ancient aching in the core of your heart. In your lifetime as Juliana, you had been completely selfish, careless, and had caused much suffering. The truth is that you knew what would happen if a lower-class man was caught in an intimate relationship with an upper-class woman. But even so, you had only focused on what you wanted. You had never considered what the fate of Matthew might be if your assessment of your father's goodwill was inaccurate. Instead, you had convinced Matthew to trust you, reassuring him that you knew how to handle your father. In the end, you betrayed Matthew's trust in the most horrendous way. You had been utterly selfish and irresponsible, with the fate of someone you loved as if he shared your very heart and soul. You were well aware of the social norms and of the fact that people in your social class supported people like Matthew only so long as they stayed in their proper social and much lower position. In that lifetime you hated Thomas for what he did, but you hated yourself even more for your own self-serving choices and for all the pain you had caused for those you loved the most. Thomas had reacted violently, but that was the way any father would have reacted in that time period. You were his dearest possession. That's all he knew. After your death, you chose to go immediately back into the game, though you were cautioned to wait until you were ready. You didn't listen and chose to be born into the Alex avatar, and you programmed yourself to choose Thomas to be a high priest, hoping desperately that your love would change him. But his heart is completely closed off from the time you were his daughter, and instead of relieving humanity of its suffering, as he had intended before being born into the program, he ultimately makes everything worse. From your current perspective, you now understand that Thomas had relied upon you to play your part by helping to remind him how to love others. But you failed him, and whatever would ultimately happen to humanity is now your responsibility as well. Thomas had genuinely believed that he could stop human suffering. He believed that his love for you would be an antidote to his disconnect from empathy. He had convinced himself that everything was just a game, and that his choices to help or harm made no difference in the long run. You are also able to see that by staying alive for thousands of years, he had never had the chance to step away from the playing field, to observe his mistakes, or reflect upon how he might have corrected them. And suddenly the strangest feeling comes over you as you realize that you are able to feel the one thing Thomas had never been able to feel: empathy. In the beginning, he'd had all the confidence in the world. He possessed a knowing that love would prevail, and that together you would play out your parts to end the suffering of humanity, as you agreed to do before either of you were ever born. And now you begin to wonder if everyone who enters the game does so with only the best of intentions, just like Thomas had done. How could you have forgotten that everything about life on Earth is completely unpredictable? It is more like a wild and rickety roller coaster ride, where the chances are far better that a player will crash and burn rather than survive gracefully. And yet you had willingly jumped back on that ride over and over again. You suddenly feel your body moving backward rapidly, as if you are being sucked into a vortex, only this time without the putrid liquid that had been previously surrounding you. You have absolutely no control over your own movement as you feel your body race past all the realms, beginning with the darkest and continuing on until you fly past people dressed in white. You think you see Delilah and desperately want to stop and tell her that you're okay, but you aren't able to slow down. And as you reach the outer limits of the spirit world, your mind begins to reconnect with Earth time. Although you can still see Delilah, her body appears frozen, as if you had pressed the pause button while watching a movie. You are now out of sync with time in the spirit world, and you are connecting once again with earth time instead.